cost of living is getting harder, and there's more to come.
Grain shortages as a result of the war will lead to a disastrous situation worldwide. The country is facing a set of challenges similar to the 1930s, the so-called Devil's Decade.
Wherever you look these days, from the Americas to Europe, the Middle East and Asia, inflation is here, and it's doing damage. It's a silent killer. You may not notice it right away, but it has the potential to destroy lives, to destroy entire economies, and even bring down governments. Who's to blame? How bad is it going to get? And when will it end? That's what we're looking at today on the Nexus. Let's start with this quick report.
Brand new inflation.
Inflation, as we said, rising more than expected.
Things are going to get worse.
Almost everything, everywhere, is getting more expensive. Or to put it another way, we're getting less for our money.
In London now, where the housing market is uniquely cursed, rents are going up by £200, £300 a month. I can tell you for free, my salary's not gone up by £200, £300 a month. So it's becoming a case of how do they expect us to survive? How are we expected to put food on the table, to have a shelter over our heads? It's impossible.
A quick scan around the world shows inflation is a pandemic. In big Western economies, inflation tends to be just under 2%, but look at it now. In Germany, they're at just under 8%. The United States just above 8%. And in the UK, it's above 9% at a 40-year high. We haven't seen figures like this in major Western economies since the 1970s. And inflation's only expected to get higher. It is worse still in the Middle East and Africa. We have Egypt above 13%, Nigeria close to 18%. Moving to Asia, it's a mixed picture. China is just above 2%, not clear though how much we can trust their figures. And then in India, it's at 7%. Sri Lanka now has one of the highest inflation rates in the world at 39%. Bear in mind, it was just 5% the year before. All these figures are calculated in a similar way, a similar methodology around the world. Governments look at how much a basket of goods costs today compared to a year ago, and boom, you get inflation numbers. The basket of goods typically includes petrol and other fuels, food, and clothes. So for example, if your typical basket cost $100 in May last year, but costs $139 in May this year, you're living in Sri Lanka. So who or what's to blame for our money becoming worth less? There are a few possible perpetrators here, so let's take a look at the three main suspects: supply chain problems, increased demand, and the government itself. One prominent economist, the Nobel Prize-winning Milton Friedman, once said that inflation was always and everywhere the government's fault.
A very simple reason that neither the businessman, nor the trade union, nor the housewife has a printing press in their basement on which they can turn out those green pieces of paper we call money. Only Washington has that printing press, and therefore only Washington can produce inflation.
Is he right? Well, we know that governments around the world printed vast sums of money when the last great financial crisis hit in 2006 and 7. All that quantitative easing was to prop up the financial system and to stimulate the economy.
That is essential to helping America's economy weather the financial crisis. The Senate passed the same legislation on Wednesday night. When Congress sends me the final bill, I'm going to sign it into law. There were moments this week when some thought that the federal government could not rise to the challenge.
They printed yet more money when the coronavirus pandemic hit a decade later. Governments splashed out on furloughs, paying for people not to work, but stay at home.
I am making available an initial £330 billion of guarantees, equivalent to 15% of our GDP.
Over the past 15 years, major central banks have pumped $25 trillion into their economies through quantitative easing alone, with over $9 trillion in response to COVID-19. All this printing money was bound to reduce the value of the cash in our pockets. But is it the major reason for the inflation we're seeing today? Some say no. They believe that the pandemic actually increased demand for certain goods, pushing prices up. For example, while we were all sitting at home instead of going to work, we spent more on renovating our homes, on extensions, on home office equipment and gyms and second-hand cars, causing shortages in computer chips and other things, including building materials. Now let's look at the final explanation: supply chain disruptions. The pandemic severely disrupted the flow of goods around the world. Then, just as that was easing up, Russia attacked Ukraine. Okay, let's bring in our guests now. We have 4 economists, so we'll probably end up with 5 opinions. Patrick Boyle is a professor of finance at King's College London. Steve Keen is a research fellow from just around the corner at University College London, although in Amsterdam right now. We also have Habiba Ben Barka in Geneva. She's the chief of Africa section at the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. And finally, we have Frances Coppola, who wrote The Case for People's Quantitative Easing. Okay, welcome, all 4 of you, to the Nexus. Patrick, I'd like to start with you. We heard in that report Milton Friedman saying the cause of inflation everywhere is always with the government. Do you agree?
Well, not really. I'm a big fan of Milton Friedman's, but, obviously there has been an awful lot of stimulus, but equally in the last short while we've seen many sort of supply-driven events that have caused inflation. We've essentially seen, a war between the biggest oil producer and the biggest grain exporter in the world, which of course will drive up costs. And then we've got the zero COVID policy in China, the world's factory, which means that there is, there's big supply constraints that we're looking at. It's not just purely demand.
You say quite a lot of stimulus. According to some economists, it's $25 trillion over the past 15 years through quantitative easing. I mean, isn't that bound to increase inflation?
It should have an effect, and obviously even, that is the purpose of that, is to push demand. But actually, we didn't really see as much demand as you might have expected, simply because the money didn't really work its way through the economy.
True. Steve Keen, out of all the different factors we've heard in that report, which one would you rank highest for having perpetrated this inflation?
Well, it's clearly the impact on productivity of both COVID and the war and approaching climate change dramas, which are affecting initially agricultural products, but also the cost of energy. And all these factors are something which you can't control using interest rates. And you also have to be very careful about where you think monetary stimulus goes, because when you do the double entry bookkeeping and look at where did the actual quantitative easing go, it didn't go to Main Street. It went effectively what Michael Hudson calls the Wall Street helicopter, not the Main Street helicopter. And that meant it inflated asset prices. It did very, very little impact upon the consumer economy.
That's a really interesting point. So the money stayed within the sort of the big Wall Street and the City of London, all that kind of crowd, rather than filtering down into the real economy. I mean, how does that work? Because you think the more money there is in circulation, it doesn't matter where it is known to be there, and therefore it must dilute the value. No.
It does matter where it is, because this is where mainstream economists, including especially Milton Friedman, do not understand double entry bookkeeping. They don't understand, therefore, where money goes. When the Federal Reserve buys bonds off the banks, it gives them cash and reserves and reduces their bond holdings. They can't do anything about that. But when they buy off non-bank financial institutions, it does the same thing. Their cash reserves go up, their holdings of bonds go down. They will then use that money to buy financial assets, particularly shares. And they're required to. They can't go out with the money for QE and go and buy a Mars bar. Okay, they're required to buy the Mars company instead. Okay. So what you get is inflation of asset prices, not inflation of consumer prices.
Frances Coppola, you wrote a book, and in fact you're sort of advocating for quantitative easing, but it needed to be assigned in the correct way. Explain.
Well, I'm really saying pretty much the same as Steve, that the way they do quantitative easing inflates asset prices. Now, when you've got asset prices in free fall, that can be a good thing. And that's what happened in 2008 and actually again in March 2020. But then after that, the money simply was not getting to the people who needed money. In 2008 and the aftermath, we had 10 years of stagnation, constant quantitative easing, but no significant growth because the money wasn't going to where it was needed. During the COVID pandemic, what we had was the fiscal authorities stepping in and distributing really rather a lot of money, supported by quantitative easing from the central banks, which kept people alive. It kept people alive. It kept them close to their jobs. It enabled them to survive the pandemic. But because it was often very poorly targeted, it also increased the savings of people, particularly towards the upper end of the income distribution. We also had people who were working throughout the pandemic and were unable to spend their incomes, so savings went up because of that. As we come out of the pandemic, people start to spend that money. It goes into the economy. The supply side, as Patrick mentioned, is really quite damaged. It's not really able to respond that quickly, and so inevitably prices go up. That's a considerable cause of the current inflation.
Sort of a perfect storm, really, pent-up demand, supply chain. Habiba, obviously there are many different economies in Africa, very diverse pressures. Some are better managed than others. But insofar as a number of economies have been caught up in the sort of global picture, where do you put the blame for that inflationary pressure?
I think the inflationary pressure on African economies has had different factors. So the different global crises that we went through since 2008 had those impact on the pressure that African countries have been facing. But also when we talk about climate change, the impact of the environmental pressure that they have been having, especially when it comes to food inflation, which is the major inflation crisis that African countries are facing now, and which, of course, in terms of impact, has significant impact when it comes to the social tension that are coming out of those pressures, but also security issues, and most importantly, debt rising, so debt vulnerabilities that those African countries, so which increasing the risk of borrowing at higher price on the global markets.
Right, we played the blame game, if you like, in different regions. Patrick, let's switch now to how we are seeing the pain of inflation manifest itself. In the UK, we've just had figures out for inflation. Haven't seen these sort of figures for nearly 40 years or 40 years. How is this affecting people in their everyday lives?
I mean, I think it's broadly affecting people. You know, every newspaper you pick up in London talks about the cost of living crisis. And really, I think even what worried the Fed a few days ago when they moved from the expectation of raising by 50 bips to 75 bips was just that you see inflation going into services. Because, you know, when you can see it just in goods that you can blame on a supply chain, it's one thing. But, you know, when it becomes more broad-based, it's more of a problem.
And we're seeing actual social consequences now, aren't we? We're seeing strikes, national rail strike this week. People in the public sector saying that their finances, their salary, has actually fallen well short of inflation.
Well, I think in the UK, when you see inflation is at 9.1%, you know, I don't think many people have seen a pay raise at that scale. So yes, I think people are feeling that squeeze. And then as rates go up, they get squeezed on their mortgages. You know, food price has gone up. The price of heating has gone up, or running a car. So yeah, I mean, it's fairly broad-based.
I wanted to mention, actually, this is the public sector particularly has had a very long pay squeeze. It's really had its pay rises capped at or below inflation for pretty much the last 12 years. So it's kind of understandable that now they are suffering a significant erosion of their income on top of that long-running gradual erosion. They're beginning to say enough is enough, especially as many of them worked extremely hard during the pandemic.
It's always a very...
and I guess feel that they deserve to be rewarded for it.
Industrial action is always a very tricky one to win public opinion over and to win politicians over. It causes enormous inconvenience, but on the other hand, if you look at the figures, they've got a case. Now, the Independent newspaper pulled out something quite interesting. They're saying that behind closed doors, Downing Street is looking at removing the cap for people in the city and their bonuses and so on, whilst at the same time calling on public sector workers to show restraint in their demand for salary increases. Do you think that's hypocritical?
Yes, I do. I think the optics are extremely bad. I kind of understand why they're doing it. But I just think politically it doesn't stand up, and it's a very foolish move at the moment.
Steve, we've heard from Larry Summers, the former US Treasury Secretary, and he said that the Fed, and of course other central banks as well, should move rates higher and will have to accept, in fact, cause millions of jobs to be lost in order to tame inflation. First of all, do you think that's what they're going to do? And is that really politically and economically the right answer?
Well, if it gets rid of Larry Summers, that'd help. So, no, it's not the right idea. And I think I'll take Frances's point back even further. You've had pretty much since the mid-1970s, there's been no real increase in real wages, particularly in America. And if you factor down and say, what are the main causes of rising prices? There's the productivity issue, first of all. How many units of output you produce per worker, per piece of raw material input. That's falling right now. That's a new factor that's pushing current inflation. There's the bargaining power of your suppliers of inputs, which are the workers and the raw materials companies. The power of the workers have been declining for 40 years now. So they've been squeezed literally for 4 decades. The raw materials producers rise and fall depending upon environmental situation and general economic pressure as well. The real rise of margin has been increasing margins from the firms. The firms have been putting up their prices compared to what they're paying for their inputs. So there's been a huge increase in the rate of profit. And that's what's got to fall, unfortunately, rather than workers' wages. You simply can't push workers, particularly in the America and the UK, below the levels they're at now.
Habiba, we've heard that wheat prices across Africa have gone up 60%. Is that correct?
Yeah, wheat crisis has increased significantly globally. So as price taker of different of those cereals, I think African countries don't have much option than to purchase at those significant increasing prices. But it's what is more relevant to mention here is that not only wheat prices have increased, but different cereals also have increased, which has impacted also inflation on the continent. So it comes to rice, maize, but also some of those starchy roots, although they are produced locally, such as yam, sweet potatoes, and so on. The reason the prices have increased is not because countries are necessarily importing those products and because of any significant global prices fluctuation happening there, but it's mostly because of the inputs to the farming of those different crops when it comes to the price of fertilizer. So the energy crisis, for instance, the crisis of energy prices has impacted first of all, the price, but also the availability of fertilizer that most African countries have been using when it comes to farming at either the small or large scale. So that has been quite has had an impact on African economies.
Okay, we're getting about halfway through the program now. Patrick, I want to move on to solutions. As we know, central banks are increasing interest rates around the world. I heard something like 45 central banks have increased interest rates. We've already had a bit of a clue from Steve that this isn't a great solution because it's addressing the wrong problem. What do you think?
I think it's the only solution that they have, though. Basically, the Federal Reserve needs to get, inflation under control. There's nothing they can do about the supply side. There's no sort of monetary policy that will change the flowing of oil or things like that. And so essentially, their only way of bringing inflation under control is to reduce demand by essentially, squeezing the public. Basically, it makes higher interest rates make people less wealthy. They spend less, and that reduces inflation.
And if they spend less, businesses could go bust?
Well, businesses could go bust and people will likely lose jobs as interest rates go up. That is the effect. It's a very blunt tool, and that is what it does.
Is anyone able to offer a solution that isn't interest rate based? For example, what we have here, as you've all said, we need to fix the supply chain after the pandemic. And what about trying to end the conflict with Ukraine? Of course, people are trying to do that, but isn't there going to be an added impetus now to do that, to negotiate with Russia, perhaps come up with a solution? Who wants to go first?
I'll dive in.
Yeah.
Okay. We have to realise that we've had a 40-year period of falling prices courtesy of globalisation, which has meant we've got these enormously long supply chains, and their fragility now is what's causing rising prices at the moment. Now, frankly, over time, we're going to see production move back onshore. Those supply chains, they're not going to be made unfragile. They're going to remain that way, even worse, in fact, with climate change. So we're going to see a need to bring production back onshore, and that will increase prices. The cost of production will rise, and that necessarily pushes everything up.
Yeah.
The same thing for the impact of global warming. That is going to make agricultural supplies much more fragile. Those costs will rise. We're going to see rising prices no matter what. So there isn't a simple instrument that can end it like interest rates. You may have to do something like the Prices and Incomes Accord that Australia had decades ago, but you're still going to see rising prices.
Steve, you mentioned global warming a couple of times now as a factor for inflation. There are Conservative politicians in Canada, for example, they're all over the world, who say, actually, if Canada could only release its oil reserve potential, energy prices would come down and inflation would come down. Obviously, I can tell by your facial expression, you don't think it would be worth the cost to the planet, but financially, do they have a point?
If they would have a point until such time as they lose a few more Canadian towns. I mean, I find it hilarious that Canadians are talking about it when they cop, 46-degree temperatures back in 2021, which led to a fire that wiped out the town with the highest temperature on the planet, which is a Canadian town. And I think was it Vancouver that got cut off because of collapses of roads, both the fires and the floods immediately afterwards. I'm sorry, this is where we have politicians thinking they can negotiate with the climate. The climate does not negotiate.
That's a great quote, Steve. Yes, Frances, come in.
I was going to say something about Russia, actually, because this perfect storm of Russia and the pandemic, neither of which you can really negotiate with. You can't, as Steve said, you can't negotiate with the climate. You can't negotiate with a virus. And I am personally of the opinion that negotiating with Vladimir Putin is also a mug's game. And so we are.
Why would you think that? I mean, he has interests like any human being and any leader of any country. Surely he has a price he would like to exact from NATO and the West?
Yeah, the price is Ukraine. Are we going to hand over Ukraine to him?
Is the price Ukraine, or is it the price of demilitarizing Ukraine and promising that they won't enter NATO?
No, the price is Ukraine. He's made that very clear. I mean, I know there's been this kind of demilitarization rhetoric, but if you actually look at what he says in Russia.
So apart from interest rates, what solutions are out there?
I think we are in a position where we need to start adapting to things. We need to start and actually looking at the longer term and stop doing this knee-jerk response to every little blip in whatever rate it is that we happen to be targeting today, whether it's the GDP or it's government debt, the deficits, or it's inflation. We seem to have a fashion in indicators where we kind of look at those to the exclusion of all else. I remember 2010 when everybody was focusing on government deficits to the exclusion of all else. And the response to that was 10 years of extremely harmful austerity that caused not only caused stagnation, but it also meant that we were ill prepared for the pandemic when it struck, and we are also ill prepared for a war. We need to be looking wider at this, and we need to be saying to ourselves, we have trade-offs here. So Larry Summers wants far more people to suffer the misery of unemployment, which he is not at risk at himself, in order to bring down inflation. And I say, is that really the right thing to do? Is this inflation that over time might calm itself down? Is this inflation that can be mitigated with fiscal policy? Can we protect the most the people who are most harmed by this?
Need to squeeze in one last question.
Is never across the board.
Habiba, I need to squeeze you in just before the end of the show. Just quickly, in terms of solutions, what would you like to see to counter inflation?
Well, in Africa, like you mentioned earlier, there are different economies at different stages of development, and some of African countries that are food import dependent, for instance, and some of them import more about 40% of the cereal from Russia and India. Of course, the end of the war, the crisis will be very relevant for them. But for the continent in general, what is important is for them to develop the food production system, to modernize it, to upgrade it, and like it was mentioned before, relying less on oil energy, oil-related energy, but more on renewable energy, because it affects not only productivity in general, but it affects also trade of goods and services on the continent. And I'm finishing on one word, a promising content on the continent is the establishment of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which we started implementing, and we hope that with that specific agreement, African countries will be able to create more regional value chain and be able to build significant resilience and be more sustainable when it comes to productivity, whether it's in the agricultural sector, in the energy sector, or any type of industrialization system. Thank you.
Habiba Ben Barka, Steve Keen, Patrick Boyle and Frances Coppola, thank you all very much for your contributions to the Nexus today. It's flown past. Thank you. And thank you at home and on your phones for watching. If you want to see this episode or any of our previous episodes, do go to our channel on YouTube. Just type in Nexus TRT World. Till next week then, goodbye.